All righty. Okay, here we go. Thanks again for coming, everyone. Last year, so I'm gonna set this panel up with a little bit of a rambling prelude, if that's okay. Last year was the first time that we did this event, and Michael Mosier, who is that one over there, he was on stage with Rebecca Reddick, and they discussed some policy research that they did last year, where they made an argument that genuine DeFi systems should be regulated more like communications infrastructure, and that policymakers should facilitate an environment that encourages and incentivizes crypto companies and other entities to share information about security threats. It was in this context that Mike mentioned the role of the Security Alliance, which Samczsun has founded. He's the one on the screen. And he teed up this year's panel. There's no better argument that DeFi networks are critical infrastructure than Tornado Cash. The government views the use of this technology by foreign adversaries as a national security threat. Specifically, the North Korean government has used Tornado Cash as part of a broader scheme to raise funds outside the traditional global financial system where it faces sanctions. The operators of this scheme are state-sponsored hackers, collectively known as the Lazarus Group. The conflict over Tornado Cash has inspired new thinking around how to use advanced cryptography to help manage illicit finance risks. And many of the discussions that came before this one and after this one will explore that larger idea. But this session is about the risks themselves and how folks like Casey, who's sitting immediately to my right, and Sam are dealing with those in their day-to-day work. Obviously, the Lazarus Group is far from the only criminal entity using crypto to its advantage, but no threat to the crypto industry seems more existential. So what I'm going to do now is go around the panel and give each of our panelists a chance to introduce themselves. And if you could also answer an additional question, which is, how do you come into contact with the Lazarus Group? And is there something that people don't realize that you think that they should realize about the Lazarus Group? Let's start with Casey.
Sure. Awesome. Thanks, Mike. So Casey Golden, I'm a really sort of short lifetime entrepreneur, started businesses quite early, can look at LinkedIn and other things to sort of get that path. But currently we are one of, if not the leading firm to help get money back from victims. So Hester, right, they should have called us actually. We actually have the most significant sort of impact on the Bybit case, right? The number one sort of leading company to freeze assets and get them returned to victims. So in short, we have a global sort of network of investigators. We spun out of Chainalysis about a year and a half ago, a little bit more for those who are familiar with them. Just focusing on the people, right? It's not a services company, but there's a lot of things that we are doing to focus on helping the victims of crypto crime. So we help large heists, right? The 1.4 billion in Bybit. We also have a nonprofit called Not Forgotten for those victims who don't have money to pay. So it goes across the board. There's people who are being exploited in different mechanisms, but our job is to do our best to help in that time of crisis, but also work on the prevention side. So there's some things that we can talk about as well. We encountered Lazarus. We probably have 25 or so open cases that are all tentacles of that beast concurrently, and they sort of operate. One thing that probably is not necessarily maybe understood as much is that they're a very highly organized organization. It is basically sort of probably one of the most sophisticated sort of like money laundering sort of groups that we've come in contact with. They're very efficient compared to sort of like individual hackers, right? And how we sort of process them. So I think thinking about it is for Bybit, they stole $1.4 billion in February, for those who are not familiar with that. They've already exfiltrated $1 billion of that to their sort of weapons program. So it's a very fast paced, it's a lot of sort of like stuff that's happening concurrently, but they're very, very organized, methodical about what they do. And so that kind of leads us into sort of how we try to do our best.
Mike?
Hi, Mike Mosier was the acting director of FinCEN, the U.S. Financial Intelligence Unit, and actually did a privacy initiative when I was there, bringing folks like Matt Green, Electric Coin Company, and others to actually focus very much, like Commissioner Pierce mentioned, on moving us from a post 9/11 data collection to a post let's not exploit people and prevent it to begin with, so we're not chasing it afterwards, and did a whole privacy initiative and brought in some folks to work on that. Hopefully this administration will come back to that and resource that, and we'll talk a bit about resourcing, how that plays in. Also was the counselor to the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury for cybersecurity, emerging tech, and for a while was tasked on the SolarWinds remediation. So also lived the types of data that get exfiltrated, but also how hard it is to try to clean up afterwards. The only last sort of relevance to, I guess, to it in the government was I was director at the White House National Security Council and led the first cyber executive order on financial system intrusions. So this is not a new issue at all. But I think to your point, Mike, like the networks that we're talking about now are different. And then was the first in-house counsel at Chainalysis, with Casey, and then also now co-founded a law firm that's similar. It's like former national security officials who are also in-house in crypto. I was also in-house at Chainalysis, Espresso Systems, building configurable privacy, which I left FinCEN to join a privacy project for the exact same reasons that Commissioner Pierce was talking about, that we need to protect people up front. Actually, so to your last point on things people may not internalize about Lazarus, the only point I would add from a government perspective is this is a pretty classic hybrid actor. So it's operating both with financial incentives, but also non-financial incentives. It's associated with a reconnaissance bureau and DPRK. And so some of it is very financial and in some levels predictable. And then some of it is extremely non-financial. And it's espionage, it's exfiltration of information. And Casey mentioned the 1.5 billion. Just to level set, North Korea's overall annual trade is about $2 to $2.3 billion. So 1.5 billion is an enormous amount compared to their whole total trade, which means they have an enormous incentive to resource this, and they're an extremely autocratic, state-directed country that will just say to people, "This is what you're going to do." They will send people. There's dormitories all over the world where they just send people to just do these hacks and to train, and they'll just tell you from day one, like, this is what you're going to do for the rest of your life, is learn how to hack. So this is not a private sector only or government sector only. Like, the level of sophistication and resources that are poured into basically sustaining 60+% of their economy is way beyond like the government or anyone else, including the fact that these systems are extremely fast evolving right now.
Excellent. Sam, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, happy to. So my name is Sam. I'm the founder of SEAL, the Security Alliance. Previously, I was a partner at Paradigm. And so you can imagine my day-to-day involves doing a lot of things across the security spectrum. SEAL, our mission is to secure the future of crypto. We end up doing that through instant response. We do threat intelligence sharing. We do best practices. And so I end up having a bit of a role play in all of that. I think something interesting that people might not realize about Lazarus, Casey mentioned that they have a very sophisticated money laundering program, and that is certainly true based on the little I've seen of the traces. What is interesting to me is that their infiltration methods are actually not as sophisticated. When you think about hackers, you think about people in dark rooms hiding away, clicking their keyboards for hours on end, exploiting, 0 days and root shells and all these other things. And in practice, very rarely, at least in crypto, does Lazarus actually deploy any 0 days. All the hacks that they've exploited so far that we've seen, they're actually the result of, from a technical perspective, the malware is very basic, actually. The malware is basically about as off-the-shelf as you can find. Where they really shine is in the human layer. They're really, really good at finding that one person in your team, in your org of 1,000+ people, that's going to click on that link one time, download that one software, and the rest is obvious. But the actual technical component is not nearly as sophisticated as people think.
It's interesting. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Sam. Can you describe a real-life example that illustrates the current state of information sharing and how Seal works and how Seal works with Casey's company, Zero Shadow?
Yeah, well, I think we all love to cite the Bybit hack as an example. I'm sure Bybit PR is not a huge fan, but I will point out one once again. It's a very classic example of how it gets resolved at Seal. And so with Seal 911, we've set up a public Telegram bot where anyone can ping us to alert us of an incident. We also obviously do our own monitoring. And so when the Bybit hack occurred, red alerts went off everywhere because $1.4 billion of tokens just moved on one go. Very quickly, we were able to coordinate across our different hotlines, which is these group chats that we set up with various key participants within the crypto ecosystem. We set these up with an SLA, so the understanding is that if either party messages in this channel, then this is a very urgent situation. And so very quickly, we were able to coordinate across all of our stakeholders to figure out, is this a routine cold wallet maintenance, or is it something out of the ordinary? And obviously it was. So from there, we were able to work with forensics firms like Zero Shadow to identify where the funds went. We were able to connect law enforcement and forensics firms with Bybit themselves. We were able to help the affected actor, in this case Safe, try to triage where exactly in their infrastructure this compromise happened. And so I see Seal 911's role as one of being almost being that dispatcher, right? We have the in-house expertise to provide people real-time assistance when they need it, but equally importantly, we seek to connect all the people who can't provide help with all the people who need the help. We should provide all the people who have the data with all the people who need the data. And that is actually something that is equally important, if not more important, in the crypto security space right now.
Excellent. To what extent does Seal interact with, collaborate, work with law enforcement officials?
Yeah, we do our best to work with law enforcement as much as possible. I know there's a bit of a reputation within the crypto space that crypto people hate government, hate public sector, never want to work with a law enforcement agent in their lives, and I can tell you that's not true. We actually, one thing I'm very proud of is crypto is definitely a very isolated space in some sense. Not many people have LinkedIn, not many people have an email address on their website. Basically, no one uses phones. And so as a law enforcement agency, for example, if you're the FBI and you need to get in touch with a potential victim of the Lazarus Group, you might not be able to get in contact with them because all of your traditional methods of outreach are just not available. And so one thing I'm really proud that we've been able to do is to be that touch point for the FBI, such that when they need to contact a very crypto-native protocol, we are able to connect them with that protocol so they can perform that victim notification and potentially stop a hack before it happens.
Super interesting. Okay, this question is for Casey. Can you describe the biggest obstacles and challenges today in the context of information sharing and incident response? Are they technical? Are they legal? Are they a combination of both?
Yeah, there's a lot of limitations, so I'll just kind of go through an example of what we try to do. So one of the things that touches on what Sam had said is that if we want to, in the typical context of any ISAC group, right, share information amongst different corporations about threats and models and all those things that we can get out there, that's relevant as long as the giver and receiver have appropriate GRC-related standards, right? The risk and compliance and SOC 2 and ISO, all those things are in place. However, in the crypto industry, when we share information to and from, whether it's service providers, analytic companies, what we have to assume is that any intelligence we share, right, to Chainalysis, to a system, to whoever, is already compromised. For the reason that, what Sam had said, there's a plague out there where IT workers are being compromised at these companies. It's not a technical surface area, it's a human surface area. In the Bybit one, we can go through an example if you guys like, of actually how that happened to kind of give context. But what happens is that Sam and our teams work all the time at scourging out IT workers who are hidden, stealing information, not just money. And so the challenge about sort of sharing information is as soon as we identify the money went over to this wallet, this account, the bad actors know that too, right? So we're actually having to rewrite a lot of the sharing infrastructure to be ideally more of a zero knowledge share, where they can't just read the information and know it in real time. It has to be a truly authenticated sort of user that sort of asks for permission with the right authorities and all these things that are there. So we're having to rewrite sort of GRC standards in an industry that's not GRC mature. So I think that's one of the challenges in information sharing. And so that's one of the things that we're doing with Sam and ourselves, and then also industry participants, is trying to establish this data sharing sort of layer, right? That can sort of preserve privacy, but at the same time, not expose information when somebody's been hurt and they are just trying to sort of get their money back, right? So it's this balance, it's this dance that we try to do, but I think that's one of the things that we're facing all the time. So to answer your other part of your question, part of it's technical because we have to provide this sort of like sort of a zero knowledge layer of information sharing. Part of it is human because that relies on people sort of doing a better job at protecting their human surface areas within the companies that we serve. And then part of it is a law enforcement coordination, because on the other side, one of the largest issues, and just to give context to what we deal with, is for the IC3, which is where people go to report sort of crimes, right? Every year, I believe there's around 148,000 reported cases in 2024. Yet there's probably less than a dozen active FBI agents who are working those cases all the time. So as you can see, imagine like 3 times the size of the stadium here. People trying to get one gate. There's only 12 people. Takes a long time. You're not going to get served enough. So the reason I bring that up is it's forcing us in the private sector to facilitate and accelerate the sort of the support for victims that outpaces the speed that law enforcement itself can act. So it's really a public-private partnership that we're trying to sort of drive with information, and there's legal aspects to it as well, about when we freeze money, who's liable for it. If we return money, it's actually not the real actor. Like all these complicated scenarios that we're actually putting forth some coalitions around that, participating together. So it's complicated, I guess is the other way, but
Work in progress.
We're taking step by step.
Work in progress, right. Sam, do you have anything to add to what Casey just said?
I would just add that, yeah, I would say crypto over the past few years have gotten really good at instant response. You know, if you look back through the early 2020s, when these hacks were happening, we went from a point of, you know, the hack happens and everyone panics and no one knows what to do, to a point where the hack happens and basically every security researcher jumps on and is able to help resolve the incident, you know, within an hour's time, right? We've gotten very good at tracing the smart contract calls to figure out where the vulnerability is. We've gotten really good at tracing where the funds go to figure out, you know, which exchanges to contact. And these are skills that we've leveled up over the past few years. I would say that much like where we were with incident response in the early 2020s, this was a similar situation with regards to threat intel sharing, right? I don't think we have the pipelines built up to get data from one point to another. I don't think we quite know what exactly we can even share beyond, you know, basic address labels that the analytics companies are getting today. And I don't think people really know what to do with this data once they get it, right? And so I think there's basically just a lot of infrastructure and a lot of cultural changes that need to happen before crypto can truly level up to the point where traditional finance and indeed the rest of the world is at with regards to financial sharing.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mike now. I've heard you say, or make the argument that there's an alignment between the crypto industry and the U.S. government on Lazarus in the context of national security. What is needed, in your view, from each side in order to take full advantage of that alignment and perhaps address some of the challenges that Casey and Sam spoke to?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, and Casey mentioned ISACs, which are information sharing and analysis centers, which goes way back a couple of decades. And it's across different types of critical infrastructure, including financial services, that are set up as public-private partnerships that create the channels that Sam was talking about, where we need the information channels that actually get this to flow, especially in real time. And so some of that needs to be recreated, and we've done it before, including security standards for those pipelines, as well as sort of the operational security elements. Like Casey was saying, we have to assume in DeFi at times when they're sharing threat information that it's just going to go out. We don't know where it's going to go. The law enforcement and Treasury and other folks like that are not used to that. They're used to stoplight protocols and thresholds of who gets access. And as the financial intelligence unit at FinCEN, it was the same even for the BSA database. There were certain local police that had levels of access, and then the FBI and IRSCI had other levels, and then the intelligence community had others that also prevented them from seeing certain U.S. Actors. And so they're used to very much controlling that. And so finding out what's the new sort of pipeline and thresholds and ways to do that in a situation where it's actually extremely decentralized. And the FSI SAC right now, even though it's a large group, it's very known actors. So when something goes out and it gets leaked, we know it was Goldman Sachs, it was Oracle, or whoever. It is not just financial actors; it's financial adjacent. So the government's used to dealing with infrastructure providers, but it's a broad one. So I think part of it is going to be, exactly what Seal and Zero Shadow have been doing. This is what the work's been about, is like in a very permissionless and distributed environment, how do we establish channels where there's enough trust, even if we have to do it at tiering levels, which also, by the way, took like decades in the federal government just to have the tiering levels and the confidence and the pipelines to share this with Microsoft, from cleaning up SolarWinds. And so like it does take time, but the work's being done, and Seal and Zero Shadow are doing that, including setting up, working on the liability issues. Casey's colleague, Julia, who's a legend in this space, was just yesterday tweeting about, there's a case against Tether for freezing some assets on behalf of Bulgarian law enforcement, and some civil plaintiffs are suing them. Well, there's a lot of base layer neutrality conversations that we can have about it, but there's also a lot of victims with millions of dollars. And and as the point that Julia was making is like, look, we don't have time for IRSCI and FBI to go to a court and walk in with a subpoena or a search warrant every single time that we need to pause something, because often it's only 30 minutes that it's on a centralized exchange or on a particular stable coin. And so part of it is like, how do we amongst industry have a way to limit the liability, allow for an element of freezing that also maintains the necessary infrastructure base layer neutrality, and find that balance that allows us to do this also in a distributed way, because we cannot operate with a cabal of information sharing that we might be okay with in traditional finance. We might be okay that it's Oracle, Microsoft, and Goldman in TradFi. That's the whole point of crypto and Web3, is that it's an extremely distributed and resilient network. But that means this threat information has to get widely out there. And so, folks are engaging a lot with the government to work through this together, including what are lessons learned that we've done before. At FinCEN, we had to do this. We were part of Egmont, which is all the global financial intelligence units. So we also had to get the information out, but we also knew that when the Russian FIU was asking for information, it was sometimes actually not a threat. It was a political dissident in their own country that we had information on. And so we had a whole internal process, because we had to determine, are we going to turn this information over that actually might be about somebody that we consider a human rights pro-democracy activist? And then they quickly started doing it through Turkey and cutouts. And so but the point is, like, the government's dealt with this before and it can be done. We just need to do it. Part of that is probably reopening the government so we can do it, as somebody pointed out the other day, so we can work with these people. But I'm sure Congress will do it, actually.
As I was going to ask, is there a specific policy? Are there specific policies that need to be made still? Are there regulations that, like, what needs to change specifically for some of these things to be facilitated?
The good news for this is, like, it's actually not it's not regulation, really. It's there's a lot of willing people. It's putting people together and prioritizing the resources to focus on what are the pipes that, like, as Sam was explaining, like, this isn't a group that just is like everyone's going to fly into DC and meet in a conference room on short notice. Like, when I was working, I worked a lot with the Office of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection at Treasury, and we would literally put out an alert, and Goldman Sachs would send their their backbone person to DC in like 2 hours, and we would explain like a classified threat, and they would fix things and whatever. And same with AWS. That's not going to happen here. And so part of it is, and we've done this, but like Seal and Zero Shot and others, is sitting with the government folks and saying, okay, it's actually going to be Telegram. And then it's even getting through the IT security people at the FBI and IRS to say we're going to have Telegram accounts now, and whatever it's going to be, ideally Signal, but that's my own preference. But I think that so it's just work. Like the good news is there's not a lot of there's legal stuff on sharing, on people working through the liability issues and coming to agreements, but that's just lawyers. And that's easy. We don't need Congress, thank God. So I think this is doable.
Okay, going back to Sam, I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of, I guess, what's next? What's the most important next thing on the roadmap for Seal? What are you sort of most inspired to work on right now, or what is feeling the most urgent to get figured out on your end?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Seal does a lot of things across the security spectrum. And so I think the most exciting thing for us is building up our capability to not only respond to incidents and to distribute that threat intel, but also to help the community learn from that incident, right? And so we've already been working on best practices. We call them Seal frameworks. And these have been published for the last half year or so. We're working on polishing these up to make them even more accessible. We're also working on building a crypto native certification program on top of these frameworks. And our hope here is that, crypto is a very meritocratic ecosystem where people care about you if you've done interesting things, if you've built stuff, if you've shown that you're someone that should be listened to. My hope is that because of all the work that Seal's done so far, people will be more willing to listen to us when we say here is our proposal for how to help the ecosystem develop better standards, how to hold the ecosystem more accountable. Everyone wants to be able to say that they're doing great security. Currently, there's not a really easy way to actually demonstrate that. So I'm hoping that when we come in with our frameworks and our certifications, this will give people a really easy way to say, okay, this is how I can demonstrate to my users, to my stakeholders, my investors, whoever, that I've met these security baselines. And through that process, we can actually reduce the number of hacks, not just mitigate the impact of them.
And I'll give each of you a chance to answer this question, but starting with Sam, what is your message at this point for policymakers?
I will say I think I have a very different perspective than Mike and Casey do, and so I'm not a policy person by any means. What my best guess is, we would love to work with other private sector entities today and help them remediate these incidents, right? When we notice funds flowing to an exchange or to an instance op or whoever, we would love to work with them, and sometimes they would even love to work with us. But unfortunately, it seems to me that the current regulatory landscape is not very clear as far as what they are allowed to do, and as we all know, lawyers like to make sure that, the lawyer's job is to make sure that the risk is being conserved, right? And so I can't blame the lawyers at these exchanges for taking the conservative route, but it does make it a lot harder for us to be able to get that intel to them and to have them act on it. And so, from what I can tell, some sort of guidance to show that actually it is permissible to do what traditional finance has been doing with these suspicious activity reports for so long. It's actually totally fine to do this in crypto as well. I think something along those lines would be really helpful. But I 100% defer to Mike and Casey here on this one.
Casey?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two different paths. So one being on the sort of regulatory side, what I think we probably could do, because there's already existing infrastructure for financial services. So currently there is a large sort of like movement for traditional finance to sort of go on chain, right? There's $270 trillion of assets, right, in stocks and bonds and things, and there's 4 on chain, right? So there's a big movement, right? Like all the conferences, there's a huge sort of traditional finance sort of flow, right? All these companies who are sort of tokenizing and doing all these real world asset sort of transitions. The reason I say that's important is I feel that we could probably do some regulatory sort of work to make sure that all of those traditional businesses who are already under regulation ensure that everybody in their supply chain is also up to standards for GRC related content, right? So make sure they have SOC 2 compliance, make sure they have the right type of infrastructure to protect everything. So I think that's kind of a pre-existing vehicle. And the reason I say that's important is all of these in Web3 want that big money, right? So it creates a natural economic incentive for people to deploy these things and sort of get up to there. So I think in the crypto world, that'll typically sort of like flock to the light that has the money, right? So if the money is in traditional finance, we can sort of incentivize that so that we can actually sort of create more sort of like sustainable infrastructure from a policy perspective. On the other side, I think that from a after money is stolen sort of type of sort of like policy, making it so that it's more collaborative for those who are trying to share information. So currently what we have is, so for example, we identify that somebody has been socially exploited on Coinbase or any other exchange. We try to sort of communicate with Coinbase, and it's this sort of loggerhead of lawyer talk where we can't share information. Well, we can't tell you actually who the person is, and we can't really notify them because we have sort of restrictions on legal things. So there's a huge block in terms of what they think is there. So I think maybe it's not even regulation, but clarity on what they can and can't share from a data sort of like sharing perspective, because they're not used to sort of having agreed upon standards. So I think that could go outside of the government policy, but it's sort of an industry sort of accepted sort of like use case and sort of process. But those are the two things I think could actually make probably a difference.
Excellent. Mike?
Yeah, same. I mean, I think it's a lot of it on the industry side. We've got to get comfortable. I mean, like Commissioner Pierce said, the government has to get comfortable with a little more openness and freedom. I think we need to get on the legal side. I own some of this as a lawyer, but we're here to help. But particularly the centralized exchanges have to get a little more comfortable of taking on some liability if they're willing, to act in the 30 minutes to help protect people, because that's ultimately what's going to bring people in further. And then I think part of that is a very natural conversation that we have to keep advancing, which is the base layer neutrality conversation, and where we're going to say this is a no-go for that type of activity and where it isn't, in order to protect people and get them online. And I think to policymakers, it's the same thing. Like, this is a massive, massive opportunity with DPRK to get to that alignment with industry on something where it's an extremely shared threat that everybody agrees on. Like, from a policymaker perspective, like we're not trying to get people to not eat French fries. We're trying to get them to not eat glass. And like everybody's like, yeah, I'm with you. So like now is the moment. So like we need to do it. And if policymakers are just in a sort of retro mode of like, okay, well, this is our chance to shove KYC at every Cisco router out there, it's going to fail. And it's not just going to fail from their grab at it. It's going to fail the system of democratizing access and opportunity, which is the whole point of this and the whole point of the founding of the country. So like this, we can't sort of miss this. We've sort of missed it the last 4 years, and we have a massive opportunity, but it's not happening, partly at the congressional level. And so like this is an opportunity that we cannot miss, because we don't know when, just like the crypto cycles, we don't know when this cycle will happen again.
One thing, just I could, just to add on to that. So I think the centralized exchanges also have a different role versus like others, and because the majority of crime that we see through centralized exchanges is individuals, right? So versus like Bybit, an exchange itself was exploited by North Korea, whereas those who get sort of scammed by sort of sending money through Coinbase are mostly sort of human, like sort of entities themselves. So I think there are some different sort of ways to sort of like create information sharing and coordination. The other part that I would say, just to give a little bit of more insight as to what Mike was saying, when we have to get something frozen, let's say with Tether, for example, or Circle, actually, we identified that North Korea moves money into the stablecoin. Great, right? We have a wallet, we can sort of get it frozen, so we can sort of like at least take a chance to sort of prove our sort of evidence, right, that it is stolen. But what happens is we don't just have to notify Circle or Tether. We have to sort of, the next layer of that is get law enforcement support. Okay, great. Like, let's call our FBI friends, like get them on Telegram, like all these things we do to try to create this. And there's those 12, right? Like, or so, right? So it's a really limited audience, and often they work, or these criminals all times a night. So that's one. Then folks like Circle say, well, we actually have to get a court order from the Department of Justice. So it's like, okay, let's wait till the next business day and then sort of get on the docket. And like, it's this whole long process and it's already gone in 30 minutes, right? So I think there's a timing issue, right? Of the speed of settlement, right? Which is a beautiful part about Web3. Like the big businesses are loving that. Settle, boom, done. However, the criminals move at the settlement speed too. So we have to adjust our processes to at least give pause, say, hey, all right, clarify. Maybe it's right, but you need to provide more information about this process. So I think we have to address this sort of speed discrepancy as well through some perhaps policy.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So I think we have time for one, maybe two questions from the audience. Right here.
I see your hand. I'm coming.
Well, it's interesting, and I agree that standards can be helpful, but it seems to me like with NIST, right, we have a framework or a place for that to happen. So wouldn't it be just about maybe reinstituting that, because it did seem to be working through the frameworks? And anyhow, I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's extremely timely because there's a few different proposals around the Hill and in the administration on this, and I think yes, in many ways, this goes back to the ISAC comment of like, we've done this before. We've shared information with the private sector and across. It's not just one way, for sure. And NIST at the National Institute of Standards and Technology is extremely equipped on some of that. Some of it is just technology outside of their usual domain. So it's really has to be a public-private commitment to that. And also they tend to develop a standard and then move on to the next thing that they have to work on. And so I think part of this is why in our paper with Rebecca Rettig and Katya Gilman, who's here as well, that we propose actually Treasury's Office of Cyber Security and Critical Infrastructure Protection be involved in an ongoing, because they actually are the touch point for the ISACs for financial services. And so, yes, you definitely need NIST involved in it from the technical perspective to set standards. And then you need, this is going to be a 24/7 forever thing. And so we also need folks like OSIP and others to be that touch point for like SEAL and to have this information sharing. So I think it is NIST. It's a very natural point with NIST. And I think it's that with like OSIP and some other folks. And it has to be with the private sector, because there's a lot of standard setting that has to go into this. That's not just security. It's also in the way that the information flows. But yeah, I totally agree.
One more question.
Thanks. So I work in the traditional cybersecurity space, and I do work with a few Web3 companies. And what I've seen is that a lot of the hacks are happening, not always on chain. It's sometimes, and oftentimes, it's something that's happening, in the traditional cybersecurity, a lack of cybersecurity controls, such as a lack of endpoint security, a lack of, or account compromise, just very basic things that every company, should be doing. So how are we encouraging Web3 companies specifically to adopt the, security controls that traditional companies have been adopting for Web2 security?
I can touch on that, and then Sam, maybe you want to add in. So specifically, I think that's the reason why we need to sort of have, if you want traditional finance money, you have to have these standards. The reason why is that you can make sure the traditional businesses follow the rules. Are actually much better about doing that, versus if it's a protocol or system, it's just going and getting end user. They're actually not going to read the user level agreement anyway, right? They're just going to click OK. So they're not going to actually sort of have to follow through with that. So we have to have not just the idea of it, but the sort of actual like financial incentive for them to do that, because they have to invest money. So they have to see more money coming in after I put these processes and security things in place. So I think that's probably part of it. But you're right. Like there's all different types of surface areas that have been done for dozens of years, decades, right? But it's just the fact that we also have to realize, and I've been an entrepreneur many times, within 2 years, they're managing hundreds of millions of sort of assets, sort of like exposure. Like when I was doing other software companies, the worst thing they could do is steal our code. And it's like, well, you're not really going to sell that, right? It's not very valuable. So you have this team of 5 to 10 sort of really great technologists who are not security specialists, who are not cyber experts, who are not policy sort of like people. So there's a divide in terms of the team infrastructure. And so it's great that you're doing that, right, to help them actually. because their teams aren't made up of that. So we have to, but you're right, we have to create some pathway to use the frameworks. And the frameworks are there, right? Seal has some great ones as well. So how do we do that is probably through sort of like the carrot of the big money.
Anything to add, Sam?
Yeah, so here's how I would describe the situation. Is that I totally agree, first of all. Over the past few years, we've seen pure smart contract-based hacks. In other words, hacks that anyone could perform if they knew the vulnerability. We've seen that go down. And we've seen hacks that depend on some element of Web2 exposure, like social engineering, like account compromise, go up. So I totally agree with that. I think the difference is crypto was founded on many principles, and one of them being to democratize the ability to just build new financial applications, right? And I think this is something that we're not going to be able to compromise with the crypto native population on. I think this is a core principle that they won't budge on. And so we have to figure out how do we build security around this idea. And I think if you ask any security expert who's gone through a soft key audit, they're going to tell you it was one of the worst experiences in their lives. And that's for a good reason. It's because the soft key audit is extremely tedious, and it's just filled to the brain with paperwork, and you got to sit down with an auditor and talk with them for days on end about all the different controls you have. And this is something that you do when your company is hundreds of people and has millions of dollars in AR, and you need enterprise clients. And none of this is true for the protocol that was founded 3 days ago, has developed a cooling primitive and suddenly has hundreds of millions of dollars in TVL, right? Like it's not feasible for these protocols to undergo these stringent audits. And so that's why my perspective is that if we're going to meet the crypto emitters where they are, we need to come up with a set of frameworks that really define not only what is key from a Web2 perspective, but also how to think about the hybrid Web2, Web3 aspects, right? Like multi-sig signing is a combination of how do I make sure I'm not visiting a fake multi-sig page, but also how do I make sure that I'm actually signing the right transaction, right? This isn't something that a pure Web2 security framework is going to address. We need something in between that addresses both the stage that crypto companies are at and also the unique problems they're solving.
Excellent. Thank you, Sam, Casey, and Mike. It was great.